Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of both Australian and global Christian leaders when it comes to all that the Lord is doing in our time and the amazing opportunities that are in front of us to be in connection with Him and sense what He is doing, and particularly from the heart of Exponential to multiply and to see churches of all different shapes and sizes planted across our nation. And today we have the incredible honor of being joined by Rich Villodas. Rich is a very well-known Christian leader, author, and speaker, obviously based out of the US. Rich leads at New Life Fellowship in New York City, and he is the author of several books that, if you haven't already, and we will be speaking about those today, I strongly encourage you to go and have a read of. But Rich, we are so glad that you would join us today all the way from New York City.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for the kind invitation, and look forward to spending some time with you.
Amazing. Well, Rich, maybe for those who are new to some of your work and who you are as a leader based out of the US, I wonder if you'd just give us a bit of a broad stroke introduction to you, your family, your ministry, and then we can dive into some other areas today.
Yeah, I am a native New Yorker from the Brooklyn section of New York City, of Puerto Rican descent. So my mother was born in Puerto Rico. My grandparents on both sides of my mother and my father's side were born in Puerto Rico. And grew up in a home that was not Christian whatsoever, was quite indifferent towards things of Christianity. And yet it was in those early years where I would attend church with my grandparents, because my mother and my father would send me to this small Spanish-speaking Pentecostal church in Brooklyn. And it was in those moments where I got my first conceptions of who God is, or just the holiness of God, the power of God. And, by the time I was 12 years old, I asked my parents if I could stop going to church. They said, yes, that was great. And then found myself back at church as a 17-year-old because I was dating a pastor's daughter. And that got me back into church very quickly. It was an Assemblies of God church, and started, again, learning more about who God was from that particular denomination and tradition. But after a couple of years of that relationship not working out, as a 19-year-old, came home depressed one day. My four siblings were at this church that we never attended, but they were invited to that day, and my parents were at home. And I just decided to church that my grandparents used to take me to. And when I got there was just such a revival happening in that church. Amazing. Where it typically has about 30 people in that congregation. There was about 90 people that day. This preacher got up and preached from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, about a valley of dry bones, and gave quite the evangelistic appeal to receiving the breath of God, the breath of life. And 15 family members responded to faith in Christ that night in August of 1999. And, we're weeping at the altar, cousins, uncles, aunts. It's just remarkable. And that set me off on a new trajectory. I started attending that small church week in and week out, got discipled by the pastor there, got opportunities to preach and teach. When it's a small church, everyone gets an opportunity to do whatever. I mean, I led worship when I can't sing a lick, and I got numerous opportunities to lead worship, which is so funny to me. But from that point on, I went to Bible college in New York and went to seminary thereafter. Started working at a church in Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Tabernacle, where I oversaw the college and young adult ministry there. And by the time I was 28, had heard of this church called New Life Fellowship Church. And I'm not getting choked up telling the story about New Life Fellowship Church. A little frog in my throat here, but I'm not like weeping about when I was 28 years old. I found this church called New Life. So heard about this church. This guy named Pete Scazzaro, who had written a number of books on emotional health, and thought that would be a better fit for me in terms of just my pastoral vocational trajectory. So found myself there at 28, 29 years old. And by the time I was 33, I had transitioned into the senior pastor role. Wow. And so that's almost 10 years ago. since that time, and it's wild that a decade has passed by already. But yeah, here I am in Queens, New York City, pastoring a church that has people from over 75 nations, with in a neighborhood where 123 languages are spoken. And so National Geographic has called our zip code the most diverse zip code, I think, in the world, but minimally in the US.
Wow.
And it's just a beautiful, complex place to be in. And no other place I'd rather be.
That's incredible, Rich. And what year did you take over New Life? And we're going to come back to that kind of transition. But what year did you take?
Yeah. So I officially started leading the church, or in an unofficial context, in 2012, and it was October 6, 2013, that I was installed formally as the lead pastor, and and of course married to my wife Rosie now for 16 years, and we have two kids, a 13-year-old daughter Karis and an 8-year-old son Nathan. But it's next year will be my 10th year anniversary in this role.
So great. Well, one of the things that we were joking about off air, Rich, just before we hit record, was I think, at least on my Instagram feed, you're probably one of the most reshared people by way of, their reflections on ministry and pace of life. And of course, that is so integral to New Life as a church. Peter Scazzero's, ministry in emotional health. And one of the things that I've always been really interested to ask you, Rich, is this kind of idea of hustle culture, like, particularly in life, there's this sense in that we need to go fast, go hard in order to achieve great things. And in a sense, sometimes the church has been known to take on that very same sentiment and kind of very much live from a similar posture when it comes to our ministry. I wonder, particularly being in, the busiest city in the world, trying to, be a person, a leader who is wanting to make an impact for the kingdom and for Jesus, what you might kind of speak to that concept, that idea, and some of your reflections around that.
It's really interesting because of my predecessor, Pete, and his writings, and because of the things that I've written on and tend to comment on, it's often the case that people want to come to our congregation or be part of our community because they love to talk on Sabbath and rest and rhythms. And it's like, wow, at that church, I don't have to do anything. And I go, now, wait a second. Now, later, this is not what we're trying to get across here. So, I'll start it this way here. I'm not I'm not against hard work. I'm not against us sacrificially pouring ourselves out for the world around us. I'm all for a disciplined, committed, sacrificial ethos. Yeah. What I think what we're trying to get at in terms of how we think about discipleship and formation at New Life is about the interplay. It's really about the interplay of rest and work. And I think it's in a culture that's often dominated by that hustle culture ethos, where it is go, go, go nonstop. The language of limits is a 4-letter word. And no one likes the language. And truth be told, I don't like the language of limits. I want to transcend every barrier and every boundary that's before me. But it's usually when I try to do that I get myself in trouble. And so I think the response to a hustle culture is not leisure necessarily. The response to a hustle culture is not inactivity. Yeah. The response to a hustle culture is not perpetual Sabbath keeping. We get one per week, not 6. It's interplay, it's rhythm, it's living within our limits. And so whether we're talking about regular Sabbath, whether we're talking about well planned out vacations, whether we're talking about an ability every day to say, this is as far as I'm going to go, and I'm not going to go any farther in terms of my emails, in terms of my sermon, in terms of the work of the ministry, that I'm just going to say, this is the time of day where I'm just going to stop and give my attention to my soul, to my family, to some friends. And so I think that's often the misunderstanding when people come to our church and think about the discipleship that we're trying to cultivate. It's not inactivity. We have a community development corporation that serves the poor in our community. We have, a health center that sees over 2,000 patients per year. We have, 50 to 60 small groups that meet throughout the city. So we're really missionally engaged and involved. But I think the question becomes one of rhythm, interplay of work and rest.
Mm. And how, and again, you've written some wonderful material, and this Deeply Formed Life is one of your, books that has deeply impacted my ministry, and I'm sure many here in Australia have already read that. But what have you found in that to be, I guess, some of the check marks for you of going, oh, I'm extending myself here beyond potentially my limits, I'm nearing my capacity, and there's not much margin in my world right now?
In my case, I think there's two indicators. One is outside of me, one's inside of me. The outside of me has to do, my wife has no problem letting me know when I'm crossing boundaries and when I'm utterly distracted and when I'm not present. So number one, having a spouse that has repeatedly offered words of rebuke in the living room and the dining room and the kitchen and the bedroom. I mean, she's rebuked me in every room in this house, So I see that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, I've tried to really pay attention over the years to my body.
Yeah.
And by that I mean, whenever I find any kind of irregularities, any kind of stress on my body, for me, that's an indication that I better take some time to balance some things out. For example, I went on a speaking trip recently, and I don't really compound my trips very closely. I usually maybe do once a month or so. And in this case, I just had to do a couple of trips, or I planned a couple of trips that were pretty close to each other. And I tell you, Charlie, from the travel, from the speaking, from coming back to preach a sermon, there was one night, 2 o'clock in the morning, I found myself with this nausea.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, I don't think I ate anything that was bad. And it was really a nausea from fatigue. And it's something that I couldn't shake it. And I realized my body is shutting down on me right now and letting me know I better make some adjustments very quickly. Now, my hope is that I don't get to that place where I'm actually throwing up in the bathroom, before I go, oh, I better slow down here. But whether it is, my eyes twitching, or from time to time, I get like this skin rash that I know that on my hand that emerges out of deep stress. Wow. And so for me, these are indicators that whenever I start seeing these things pop up, I thought I better pay attention to my rhythms and better slow down and get to God and get to myself, and what do I need to say no to. So those are just a couple of things that one outside of myself and one inside.
Yeah, that's great, Rich. Thank you for sharing that, mate. I'm sure that would be there'd be something for every leader listening that would be a similar kind of incident that maybe they can pay attention to it in their own leadership. The next question I wanted to ask you about, Rich, you've just released a brand new book, Good and Beautiful and Kind, Becoming Whole in a Fractured World. Obviously, you were a leader in one of the world's most global cities. You spoke about the multicultural elements of it. Arguably one of the more significant, well-known global cities on planet Earth. What are some of the stark things that you have observed about the ways that the church is able to be on mission, and I guess really what it is able to offer in this cultural moment? This we're living in this age of hyper anxiety. There's so much kind of tension in our world, and of course in a city like New York, you would be right on the coalface of that. I wonder if you could just reflect on that for our listeners today.
Yeah, when I think about the church in this moment, and I have, at least in the United States, Charlie, I have kind of summarized where we've been in this acronym CPR. That's been and I think the acronym to some degree will fade in the coming months, because I do think we are entering into somewhat of normalcy beyond COVID, but who knows?
Yeah, sure.
But in terms of where we're trending, but I've called it, we're in a CPR world, a world in which our hearts are ailing, a world in which we're having a hard time breathing. And it's the convergence of COVID, the convergence of political idolatry, racial injustice that we've seen in the United States, and the wear and tear of that on our culture, on our families, on our individual lives. I was joking with some pastors recently. I get on a pastoral call with 3 friends the first Wednesday of each month, and we laughed because we were commenting that in recent months, what we have been struggling with or facing is just the ordinary problems of pastoral ministry recently. Somebody struggling in their marriage, somebody has conflict with another person, someone is trying to discern God's will. And and I just thought how wonderful it is to just have regular problems, to just pastor people through, as opposed to the regular problems, plus global pandemic, plus political upheaval and racial hostility and all the rest. And so, in light of the last couple of years, I thought that this is what the church must continue to offer to the world around us. I think the church is to offer a sense of rootedness in a world of upheaval. But by rootedness, I am talking about a life of communion with God. If we are not offering that, if we're just offering good programs and good talks and some small groups here and there, but we're not truly helping people find rootedness in communion with God for all the upheaval, we're missing out something really significant. And so, rootedness, I think about, the church has an opportunity to offer and to cultivate a way of contemplation for the mindlessness of our society, that we live in a skimming, scrolling culture, connected to our devices in ways that are mindless.
Yeah.
And what would it look like for people to have a vision of Psalm 27:4? One thing have I desired, and that will I seek after, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of God. What would it look like to create a spirituality? And that's what I think people are longing for, of contemplation, for the mindlessness that we feel. I think the church has, what are we called to? I think we're called to offer beauty for the meanness and the ugliness of our society. What does it mean to live beautiful lives? What does it mean to live lives that are marked by an appreciation for art, appreciation for music, appreciation for community? And the last thing I can think of is, I think what the church is to offer the world around us in this particular moment is an ability to be a calm presence, to live with tension. I draw a lot from family systems theory, this idea of differentiation of what it means to remain close and curious to God, to myself, and to others in times of high anxiety, and to resist the polar opposite pull of cutting people off or being enmeshed into them. And I think in a society that very rapidly cuts people off or disappears into others, and so they don't have a voice, I think what we need is an ability to be a calm, differentiated presence in which my voice can be heard and lifted, and at the same time, I'm working for a sense of community and belonging. And so I think that the church has many invitations and opportunities, but those are a few that come to mind.
It's great, Rich. And maybe for those who are hearing of this idea of differentiation and family systems theory for the first time, where would you direct them as a starter?
Yeah, there's a few books. One, if they're pastors, there's a book by a guy named Ronald Richardson, who wrote a book on the pastor and his family. We have women pastors here, so that's probably pastor and her family. I mean, our context here. So that's one. There's another book by anything by a guy named Peter Steinke. Peter Steinke wrote a book called Uproar that came out in 2018, and he's listing all the terrible things that are happening in our society in 2018. And I'm thinking, this guy, and he died, I think, 2019. He's an older man in his 80s, and I thought he had no clue what was coming, but the book was really helpful. So that book by Peter Steinke is really wonderful. Uproar. And then a friend of mine, an Australian fellow, Steve Cuss, who's out in Colorado, wrote a book called Managing Leadership Anxiety. And Steve has done great work in family systems. And so those are a few resources and people that come to mind.
Great, Rich. Obviously, we made mention of it earlier in our conversation that you've been leading New Life for almost a decade, which is incredible. And
yeah,
I guess my next question was particularly around the idea of succession. I think, particularly in this time in the Western Church, it feels like there's a lot of succession planning going on, a fear of leaders not finishing well. There's this, I think, deep sigh of relief when we see around the world in people such as yourself and others doing it well. I think far too many of us have heard bad stories. And I think I just want to kind of hear some of both your take on that, but also how you were able to discern that well as a family, as a leader, recognizing that I'm sure a leader of your caliber would have had many opportunities, and you could have gone to plant a church or to lead elsewhere in the US. How were you able to discern that, and then I guess speak to the actual nature of the succession that you guys were able to do well with Peter and him at New Life?
Yeah, with regard to discernment, and I'll mention just a couple of things that were, I think, true of my life that may or may not have overlap in application for others. And so, I recall when I was 22 years old, I was in a leadership and administration class in college. And so the first thing I want to just say is I think I paid attention to the deep promptings of the Holy Spirit. So let me just start off with that. And when I was 22, I took this class and we were talking about various leadership styles, entrepreneurial systems, builders, and all that. And when we got to one of the profiles in the class, the professor said, some leaders take what someone else has built and they build upon it, strengthening it, creating systems, helping it go to the next phase. And at 22 years old, I just thought I had not taken many assessments. I didn't take any church planting assessment, but I could tell you exactly where I was in that room, which row of seat I was in. It was the first seat by the window, the first row. And I sensed the Lord saying, that's what I'm calling you to do. And so I kind of filed that away, kind of wrote a little note to myself of, I think this is what I think God has called me to do. Now, from 22 to 28, those 6 years, I did all that I could to start a church and not do what I sensed God calling me to do. And so I was on staff for a few churches. I had multiple conversations with various denominations about the possibility of starting a church and felt very energized. And I think if I gave myself to that, I think it would have been fruitful. And I think some good things would have emerged out of that. But with that kind of deposit of a word that God, I think, put in my heart when I was 22 years old, I think I started recognizing my limitations, what gave me life. I had language for discernment before I actually started getting categories for it. And so, for example, I teach Ignatian discernment processes. Like, how do we discern God's will? And how do we pay attention to consolations and desolations? How do we pay attention to the movements of our heart and to the community of others around us? And so I did have a sense that I knew that I was a preacher. I knew that I could gather people, and I knew who I wasn't, in the sense that I knew I could not, if I was going to be entrepreneurial, I'd probably get stuff off the ground, but it'd take too much out of me to really sustain me for the long haul. And it'd probably be successful on the outside, and I'd probably be miserable on the inside. And so I think those conversations that I was having with God and with others, and just paying attention to that, I think that helped me in the discernment process, so that when the elders came to me and said, hey, Pete's going to be leaving, stepping down from this role, we think you'd be the best person to succeed him, I went right back to my 22-year-old kind of moment that I had with God in that class. And I thought, I think this is it. So I had very little praying to do, honestly, around that. In addition to that, and Charlie, I say this with, I know what my strength, I knew I was a good preacher. I knew that to succeed someone like Pete, who planted the church there 26 years, beloved by the community, strong gifts, I knew that I had to have a strong enough gift to follow him. Wow. And so that people would not go, whoa, we really went down by getting rich here. And so I did have a sense of confidence that these are the gifts that I have that I think will help me succeed in this role. And then here are the things that I know I need to grow in. I knew I needed to grow in casting vision and creating compelling vision. As a matter of fact, it was one of the areas that I was most insecure about, and areas that I needed ongoing coaching from Pete around what does it mean to get before people and motivate them to go from here to there. And I felt so inadequate for that, but I felt like I could really preach really well and connect hearts. So I think part of it was I wasn't living a false humility. It was just like, I know I'm gifted in this, and I feel like God's called me. It's my gift is strong enough for this community. So I don't want to go into too much detail with that. So that's kind of like how I was discerning God's will for that. And with regard to the process, so it was a 4-year process. I'll just highlight the big parts. 4-year process. I was brought in at the end of year 2. The other 2 years were spent clarifying what's Pete's role going to be, because he was going to stay on staff in a different capacity. What's his job description? What's the timeline? For every year when we bring someone in, how many times is Pete going to preach in this year and the following year and the year after that? How many times is Rich going to preach? Who's leading staff meetings? Who's hiring? Who's firing? So we brought in an outside consultant, and we had lots of charts to help us think through these things prayerfully and thoughtfully. So having that process and being in conversation with Pete on a regular basis. And I tell you what was really helpful. There were 2 moments where Pete left for 4 months. And I thank God that he left for 4 months, because he needed to leave, because I needed to lead without him in the room. And I needed to not have to look over my shoulder or peek at Pete. Am I making the right decision? He needed to get out of there. And I'm glad he got out of there. And then when he came back, what I so appreciate about him is not everyone can do this, because not everyone is emotionally mature and self-aware enough to do it. But the first staff meeting he got back, I kind of deferred to him on so many things. Oh, Pete's back. And he was still the senior pastor. Yeah. And at the end of it, he said, Rich, you're leading the show. You're leading this thing here. You're the captain of the ship. Lead. You don't have to keep looking at me for everything. And so having someone in my corner like that, who was actually deferring to me as a 32, 33-year-old, was really empowering and really helpful on the journey.
Rich, I'm so encouraged by both your discernment of God's will in that, but also just obviously Pete being the incredible leader that he is, that there are leaders out there like that who want to see the next generation flourish and want to do all they can to hand on well and to set the church up for its greatest future possible.
Yeah, and it was beautiful by him, because Pete is 66 now. He was 57 when he stepped down from the role, and at 53, that's when he started the process. Wow. And so by the time he started the process, New Life, if you know the story, went through lots of bumps and he had lots of bruises along the journey. He wrote the emotionally healthy stuff because there was a lot of emotionally unhealthy stuff going on. So he suffered. Yeah. So by the time he said, all right, I'm ready to start this, the elders, everyone's saying, we're doing great. We're in a great season. Why are we going to do this? But I mean, he knew himself as well that he could only take the church as far as he could, and he needed someone else to take it to the next stage.
Wow, Rich. Hey, last question for us today, because we so appreciate your time with us and sharing just some of your reflections and journey. The church of the future, obviously, we talked before about almost being in the shadow of the pandemic, coming out of what has been a very challenging couple of years. But the church of the future is going to look very different to today. Of course, there's kind of some consistent principles of which we know the Lord is unchanging. And nations are different, cities are unique. I guess just to finish off our time today, I wonder what your encouragement would be to those who are either pioneering or longing to see, I guess, the rebirth of a renewal of God's church in our nation. What's your sense for the next 10, 20, even as far as 30 years? How can we be, joining with what God is doing?
Yeah, lots of different ways to respond to that. But what I would say is a deeper kind of formation is required. And there are 3 words that come to mind when I think about what I think the church needs in this moment. And it is, it's contemplative, integrative, and historical. And by contemplative, what I mean is it is the church's job to get people to Jesus.
Yeah.
And how do we create cultures of prayer? How do we create cultures where people are cultivating a firsthand spirituality with God? How do we help people to slow down, to actually experience loving union with God in a world that's just in upheaval? So I think that first thing is just contemplative, which speaks to just the kind of presence that we bring to the world around us. So that's the first thing. The second is integrative. And by integrative, I think of it in two levels. One is that we resist on a regular basis the secular sacred split that's often perpetuated in local churches in favor of a formation that's rooted in sacramentality and sacramental. And I'm not talking about just the communion and baptism. I'm talking about what does it look like to have a holistic vision of spirituality that does not unnecessarily compartmentalize.
Yeah, it's great.
And so how do we have it integrative? And so on the one end, I'm thinking about how do we close the gap between the secular sacred split, but moreover, how do we have a spirituality that focuses on the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional? And for me, that's integrative. That to talk about spirituality in the gospel must have individual implications as well as interpersonal and institutional applications as well. And then lastly is just historical, which is to say that every new generation must have good memory. And I think one of the failures of the church in various traditions is that we have a bad case of theological and formational amnesia. Wow. That we forget that the Holy Spirit has been present in so many ways across time and space. And that no matter how beautiful our particular community, tribe, network, denomination is, there's so much more that we can learn from churches in the global South, from churches that are doing ministry in different contexts from us. And so having a historical and global perspective, who are the people we're reading? What are the insights that we need from around the world? And the gift is, because we live in a world that's become so small because of technology, we have access in ways that we haven't in the past. And so, I think of those three things, Charlie, contemplative, integrative, and historical, as we think about, the present and the future of the church.
Brilliant, Rich. Rich, you're an absolute thought leader, I think, to our generation. I'm so encouraged by our time together today. Thanks for taking the time out to dial in all the way from the other side of the globe. We so appreciate your words and are praying that they cheer on our listeners today. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.